Tonight on Nation to Nation, a cabinet shuffle shakes up Indigenous Services. But will it affect the proposed reform in child welfare legislation?
Everything will go as planned. We hope to have that legislation introduced very shortly into the House of Commons.
Seamus O'Regan's appointment shocked even the most connected in Ottawa. And NDP MP Charlie Angus questions if the Prime Minister made the right choice.
You need a minister who's willing to go in and shake things up. And is Seamus O'Regan the guy to do that? I don't know.
I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation. Earlier this week, Prime Minister Trudeau did a minor cabinet shuffle, which means we now have a new Indigenous Services Minister, Seamus O'Regan, who replaces Jane Philpott. As well, Jody Wilson-Raybould is out as Justice Minister and is now Minister of Veteran Affairs. Many commentators have called it a demotion. It was news that came as a surprise to many. Philpott, for example, was very well liked. But what does this future hold for O'Regan? Right now, all the ministers are in Sherbrooke, Quebec for a cabinet retreat. APTN National News' Quebec reporter Tom Fenario is there and joins us now. Welcome to Nation.
Hi, Todd. Thanks for having me.
Before we get into the big news of the week, what's been the point of this cabinet retreat?
Well, a cabinet retreat is something that happens basically before a session, in this case before the winter session. It's a gathering of the Prime Minister and all of his or her ministers. So in this case, the idea is to get everyone together on the same page for an upcoming session. Most of the discussion will be around policy. I guess in the case of this particular session, it's the last session before the summer break that will be heading into a federal election. So I think the Liberals will also be discussing very much the promises and policies that they need to get done before the upcoming election, things that they promised they would do after winning the last one.
As I mentioned in my introduction, O'Regan has some big shoes to fill with Philpott departing and some pressing matters to tackle, like child welfare reform. But you've met up with the new Indigenous Services Minister, and you're going to show us a bit of that interview right now.
Yes, here's what Minister Seamus O'Regan had to say regarding child welfare and many other things. Here's this clip. How are you going to get the Indigenous Child Welfare Act through?
Everything will go as planned. We hope to have that legislation introduced very shortly into the House of Commons. So we don't see much need for any delay. In fact, most of my time right now has been making sure that I assure Indigenous leadership that nothing is slowing down. The pedals to the metal on all fronts. A lot of good work has been done under Minister Philpott over the past year and a half, and I don't plan on slowing anything down. So it means a fairly steep learning curve, and I've been working in partnership with Indigenous leadership from across the country to make sure that I understand their priorities directly from them, and then we proceed.
How familiar were you with the things that are in play with regards to Indigenous child welfare before you took the office of Minister?
Familiar in the fact that we've dealt with it at Cabinet, and I am Vice Chair of the Reconciliation Committee of Cabinet, so anything regarding Indigenous memorandums to Cabinet or legislation comes through that committee. So we've been working fairly diligently on that for the past year and a half. So certainly I have some knowledge of it, but not to the same extent or intricacy as I would get from actually dealing with the leadership on it. So that's the learning curve for me.
There has been concern expressed that you don't have a lot of experience in Indigenous issues. What were your experience in Indigenous issues?
My experiences were from a while ago. I mean, it came from just growing up in the North, growing up in Labrador. I was seeing what I saw, knowing that changes had to be made. It dictated my entire academic career. So, my undergraduate and my master's degrees are in Indigenous politics, and I spent 5 years in government at the land rights table for the Labrador Inuit and Innu on behalf of the provincial government, and also dealt with impact benefits agreements like the Voisey's Bay IBA and others. So, at my young professional career, I spent an awful lot of time with it, but with all humility, that was 20 years ago. There's been a lot of Supreme Court decisions that have come out since. There's been a lot of things that have happened since, and there are people who are living this reality, not in an academic way like I used to look at it, or at land rights tables. So I've got a lot of work to do.
We're heading into an election in 2019. There's some Liberal promises that were made with regards to boil water advisories, with regards to Indigenous languages. Can you give us a quick update on those dossiers?
Those are probably two of the other top priorities that you named right there. Boil water advisories are proceeding at a pace, and we look on target to meet our goal for 2021. But you remain vigilant. These are too important to keep your eye off them. So that will go ahead as planned. And Indigenous languages, we know how important that is. And I've been working with my colleague, the Minister of Heritage, to make sure that there's no delay in that either.
Thank you, Mr. O'Regan.
Thanks.
Tom, of course, as I again mentioned in the introduction, Jody Wilson-Raybould was dropped from Justice and is now the Minister of Veteran Affairs. And she's been replaced by David Lametti. What does a move like that mean for Trudeau to have an Attorney General from Montreal with the election just on the horizon?
Well, historically, Quebec has been a very volatile province when it comes to where they will vote. Obviously, it's the second largest province of Canada. Therefore, it plays a huge role in who gets elected prime minister. And it's just going back to 1980 when the Conservatives swept into power over the Liberals. If you go and see the 90s, the Bloc Québécois wave came in and took over opposition at one point. In the 2010s, the Orange Wave, I believe it was 2011, the Orange Wave of NDP surprised everybody. So I guess the point I'm getting at is you never know what you're going to get out of Quebec. It could swing many different directions. The last election, obviously, they went back to the Liberals. So I think you could make an argument that having a justice minister such as David Lametti in power in Quebec can help swing votes a little bit more that way. Certainly folks in Montreal probably like the idea of having a justice minister who's looking after their own personal interest.
Not everyone was happy about the cabinet retreat. How were the ministers greeted when they came to Sherbrooke?
They were greeted by about almost 100 protesters. Many of them here in support of what happened the other week with the Witten territory in British Columbia. Folks here feel strongly about being able to show solidarity with First Nations, even if they are First Nations thousands of kilometers away from them. There was actually a Witten woman there by the name of Marlene Hale, and here's what she had to say.
Do you have an opinion on the new Minister of Indigenous Services, Mr. Seamus O'Regan?
I don't know what he does. We've got to do our homework and find out what they are, who he is, and what he's going to be able to do for the Indigenous peoples and the issues that are outstanding today.
He doesn't have a lot of experience dealing with Indigenous issues. How do you feel that someone who doesn't have a lot of experience with Indigenous issues was just appointed to his position?
Maybe that's why he has him. The more they don't know, the more better for him. But we'll educate him.
Tom, what else has been happening at this cabinet retreat, and when does it end?
Well, today François Legault, the Premier of Quebec, met with Justin Trudeau. There's lots of talk here about immigration, infrastructure in the Quebec region, but also we can expect a sort of media availability coming up tomorrow with Justin Trudeau in the afternoon. And there will be lots of opportunities to ask questions of ministers. The policy will be decided upon, and so we'll know more about what will come out of these meetings as of tomorrow when they end in the afternoon. And that's pretty much it.
Hey, Tom, we'll be looking forward to that report from you about tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Todd.
After the break, we speak to NDP MP Charlie Angus, who has a lot to say about the cabinet shuffle. Welcome back. Before the break, we heard from the new Indigenous Services Minister. Seamus O'Regan plans to stay the course on child welfare legislation this term. But is it possible to get it passed when it still needs to be introduced into the House of Commons? Joining us now to discuss that is NDP MP Charlie Angus. Welcome to Nation, Mr. Angus.
Thanks so much for having me back.
So how surprised were you by this cabinet shuffle?
I was very surprised, shocked even, because what we'd been told was that this was just going to be a minor tinkering, but it's not been a minor tinkering on Indigenous issues. We see a huge demotion for Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was the first Indigenous Justice Minister, and we can certainly discuss whether or not that she deserved that demotion, but losing from the Justice Department an Indigenous voice, I think sends a really disturbing message, but also taking Jane Philpott out of Indigenous Services, a department that's been a black hole of accountability. She's certainly been someone who's gained a lot of respect, but replacing her with Seamus O'Regan, no offense to Mr. O'Regan, but if you look at the bottom of the class of the Liberal cabinet, Mr. O'Regan's always down at the bottom, not performing very well, not seeming to understand the issues and the sensitivities to veterans. Well, this is going to be magnified 1,000-fold on the Indigenous Services issue, the crisis in healthcare, the crisis in education, the child welfare issues, the need to have a really proactive response of starting to hold accountability. I'm very surprised the Prime Minister put Mr. O'Regan in this position.
Of course, Ms. Philpott put a lot of things into place. A lot of the money has been in the last couple of budgets. Is Mr. O'Regan maybe just there to just steer the ship until the next election?
Well, I think what's really concerning is you see this pattern in governments before where they will say they're taking on the Indian Affairs Department, and they're finally going to start to make change. And look at the Harper government, where they put in Jim Prentice, who was arguably Stephen Harper's strongest cabinet minister, and then they put in Chuck Strahl, who was also very strong, and then it dropped down to John Duncan and Bernard Valcourt, who were much, much weaker as the government seemed to lose interest. I'm surprised that given the growing pressures that are coming from First Nation communities for action, a lot of frustration that the Prime Minister is just using nice talking points but not delivering, that they're not staying focused on the need to reform that department. You can't just go in and tinker that department and think it's going to be okay. It is a screwed up department. Children are being denied rights. You need a minister who's willing to go in and shake things up. And is Seamus O'Regan the guy to do that? I don't know. He's a very, very good friend of the Prime Minister. Nice guy. But this is a department that needs someone who's not afraid to go in and hold the department to account to improve the lives of Indigenous children.
It sounds like you don't think O'Regan has the chops to steer something like child welfare reform, for example, into legislation before the next election.
Well, let's just put this in perspective, and I have great respect for Jane Philpott, but it took 4 non-compliance orders by the Human Rights Tribunal. It took her department being found culpable for the deaths of children in Wapakika because they refused to ask for the government to get serious about this. They spent millions fighting Cindy Blackstock after the rulings came down. They're back in court again fighting Cindy Blackstock. So the government was dragged into reforms because of the legal threats that were against them for their failure to deliver to children. You need someone who's going to stay on top of this file. And, we're 8 months out from an election, and the Prime Minister put a very good friend of his in, but someone who didn't deliver very much on the veterans file. We are going to be holding Mr. O'Regan to account. I want to meet with him. I want to have a positive relationship. But my message to Indigenous communities across the country is this is the time to turn the heat up, not to sit back and wait and hope that he's going to, get a handle on a very dysfunctional department.
You mentioned you want to meet Mr. O'Regan. I suppose after that meeting, depending on the meeting, is the NDP prepared to back Indigenous Services and get child welfare reform passed before the next election?
Well, the issue of reforming the child welfare system to us has been job one. We've been on this file for a long time, working with Cindy Blackstock, going back to the original Jordan's Principle motion that was brought to the House of Commons, well over a decade ago. The issue is this has to be done with a commitment of the federal government to put the actual money that's needed on the table and to have accountability mechanisms. So if the government is willing to come forward with a credible plan that is about rebuilding communities and giving the communities back control of the future of their families, then we will be there all the way to push this through. But what concerns me is that clock is ticking on legislation, and to switch ministers now tells me that this is something the government is looking to punt off into the future, and that's not good enough for this generation of children.
Now, I just want to talk briefly about Jody Wilson-Raybould, as she was what a lot of people are saying was demoted from justice. Is her shuffle a sign that the Trudeau government is giving up on reconciliation? Well, she was one of the chief architects of that.
I had such enormous hope when Jody Wilson-Raybould was brought into Justice, because people don't focus a lot on the Justice Department. It is the militant bully boy against Indigenous rights. You have Indian Affairs, you had Health Canada, which is now Indigenous Services, but Justice is where Indian rights have been fought consistently. And I had a lot of hope for Jody on this file. I unfortunately don't think she's delivered. I certainly in our region, the St. Anne's residential school survivors found her to be more than willing to fight them in court rather than work on reconciliation. I didn't think that a justice minister is usually one of the top 2 or 3 ministers that you hear from all the time, and we didn't hear from that from Jody. I feel that was a real loss, but I'm also concerned losing someone who does have an Indigenous perspective out of justice at a time of where we see the blockades in BC and issues on land rights coming to the head. It does seem very much like a demotion for Ms. Wilson-Raybould. So was it her failure to deliver for the communities, or was it that the government is moving on to other priorities? These are really important questions that I think people need to focus on.
And of course, we are heading into an election, as we've mentioned quite a bit. So looking back on it at nearly 4 years, was Trudeau's Indigenous plan just too ambitious to pull off?
I think the problem with Mr. Trudeau's plan is that he used all the right words, but nice words, as you know, we know from 150 years of colonization, nice words haven't changed anything. We needed political action. Again, Madame Philpott began to make a lot of changes, but only after numerous court battles, the Human Rights Tribunal rulings time and time again. There are baby steps being made. There are some positive steps and more of an open door, and I credit the Prime Minister for that. I certainly credit the Prime Minister for his annual meetings with the youth from Anishinaabe Nation about youth issues. That's all good, but we need to see action on the ground. Quite frankly, the bill for 150 years of colonization's come due, and people aren't willing to listen to positive words. They want to see action. So I think the Prime Minister needs to get back on this file and prove that they're going to deliver on the beautiful words he gave us back in 2015. There's frustration that those words are just being used as words and not as action points.
On that point, Mr. Angus, I want to thank you for talking to me today.
Thank you so much.
After the break, we get some insight into the Conservatives' Indigenous platform, and we catch up with one of them traveling the Trans Mountain Pipeline route. Welcome back. The next federal election is still about 9 months away, and some Indigenous people would like to see Justin Trudeau defeated, especially because of his support of energy projects. But what would an Andrew Scheer approach to Indigenous issues look like? Earlier this week, we got a good idea. I asked finance critic Pierre Poilievre if a Conservative government would keep Indigenous Services as a separate department from Crown Indigenous Relations. His 2-minute answer was an economic spin on Indigenous issues.
We have a strong track record on the issue, and we'll have a very clear plan that will be distinct from the Liberal failures as it relates to Indigenous peoples. That plan will include allowing First Nations that want natural resource development to have those opportunities. Right now, Justin Trudeau is impoverishing First Nations reserves and communities by blocking natural resource projects that the overwhelming majority of them want to see go ahead. Those projects would create jobs for young people, skills for the local workforce, would fund hospitals and schools for the population and social services for those in need. It would give full independence to many First Nations reserves, and that's why there's a growing coalition representing the strong majority of First Nations where those projects are being proposed that want to see them go ahead. So I think one of the best things we can do to allow progress among Indigenous people is to stop the Prime Minister's paternalistic approach, which has blocked those opportunities that First Nations have wanted to achieve. We also supported the First Nations Financial Transparency Act, which gave Indigenous people the ability to see where their money is going. That would go a long way to ensuring that it gets to the people who are most in need. Finally, I would point out that First Nations people are going to suffer as a result of the new Liberal carbon tax. Many, as will all people living in rural and remote communities, it's very expensive to heat your home, to transport between long distances already as it is, and to add to layer on a new carbon tax in northern and remote and other Indigenous communities will be very costly. So those are some examples of where Conservatives offer far superior alternatives to the failed approach of the Trudeau government.
As you may know, Cathy McLeod appears regularly on Nation to Nation on her MP's panel. She's a Conservative Member of Parliament from British Columbia and is the Shadow Minister for Indigenous and Northern Affairs. This week she's been traveling the Trans Mountain Pipeline route, interviewing stakeholders and posting the videos on her Facebook page. The general idea being that the existing pipeline has not been bad for the environment, and so its expansion needs to happen sooner rather than later. Day one happened in Parkland County, Alberta. The quality of the video comes from the source.
And part of what's driven this tour is understanding how badly Alberta is suffering and really the need to get our product to market. But more importantly is to look at the idea that pipelines have opportunities for all Canadians, and they can be done in a very environmentally friendly way and provide, again, enormous opportunities. So Dane, could you tell us a little bit about, what's happening in Alberta, but more importantly about what's happening right in this location?
Well, hi, I'm Dane Lloyd, Member of Parliament for Sturgeon River Parkland, and we're here in Parkland County. And if you look just behind us here, you'll see this yellow sign. And if you're driving through these fields, that would be about the only evidence that you have that there is a major oil pipeline passing through here, and that is the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Now, in December, we just had a loss of 36,000 full-time jobs in Alberta, and we know as Albertans that these pipelines are actually critical infrastructure to ensure that we can get a fair price for our oil and gas products.
So what we have happening here, if we were here in the summer, what would you be seeing in this field?
Well, this is a fully operational seed potato farm operation here. They also grow grain and barley and canola. And you'll see farmers working, spraying the fields, checking their crops, and then in the fall, there's a full harvest. And this has been going on for, over 50 years. And during that entire time, there has been an oil pipeline running underneath this pristine agricultural land. And the coexistence between the agricultural sector and the energy sector has been very strong.
Day two, and McLeod was in Valemount, British Columbia, with local Conservative MP Bob Zimmer, Valemount's mayor, and Bruce Wilkinson, president of the Swift Creek Watershed Society.
And we've enhanced this stream through seed money from Kinder Morgan to the tune of over $700,000. We've created over 50 habitat enhancement things, and I think about 20 sites to stop degradation of the stream bed. One was the campground around the corner here, and the Kinder Morgan pipeline actually just crosses about 200 meters below us here. And it does not affect the salmon that come up this river. We're getting more salmon spawning above the pipeline than below now, partly because of our enhancement. So it's been a wonderful partnership and working thing to do this over the last 5 years. And we now have habitat that can support probably up to 3,000 salmon when we were only getting about 1,000 back.
That's all the time we have. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.